All right, so let's talk about the post-conventional. So what is post-conventional as that category, as that label? What does that mean? It's the beginning of deconstruction. So up to this point, basically the ego was busy constructing itself as the conformist and as the achiever and as the expert. There was all this construction going on by the mind. The mind was, in a sense, constructing reality and wasn't aware of how it was constructing reality. And it was so busy constructing reality for its own survival purposes, trying to be an expert, trying to earn money, trying to put on a show for people, trying to be a good boy or girl to conform to your society, in your family, and so on. So you're so busy doing this that the mind, it never even occurs to the mind that a deconstruction process might be beneficial to it. So there's sort of like this arc that happens in this 9 stages of development. You start off the first half of the arc, which we already covered in part 1, all of those stages. That part of the arc is the ego developing itself, constructing itself. And then you sort of reach the apex of that construction process right at post-conventional, the pluralist stage, as we're going to start talking about here in a minute. And at that pluralist stage, that's when the mind becomes open to the possibility of deconstruction. What do we mean by deconstruction? Well, it means turning your focus inwards into your own psyche and mind, starting to analyze it and starting to really question yourself, starting to reflect about your beliefs, your ideas, and starting to realize the socially constructed nature of reality. So a lot of the stuff that previously the mind would consider as objective, as material, as real, as scientific, as absolute, like the Word of God or the Holy Bible. The Holy Bible is considered the absolute, and you don't question it. Now you start to question it. Now you start to deconstruct it. But not just the Bible. You also start to deconstruct rationality, logic, science, government, politics, maybe the capitalist economic system under which you were raised, or if you were raised under a socialist one, then you maybe start to deconstruct that one. You basically start to deconstruct all aspects of your culture. You start to question it, and you start to ask yourself, well, is this really true for all people everywhere? Or is it just something local and sort of rather arbitrary to my little culture, my little subgroup, my family unit, my corporation, my religion, or something like that? So relativity is a huge theme of the post-conventional stage. Relativity becomes acknowledged, whereas before it wasn't. For the mind to be able to think relativistically, this is a huge leap in cognitive advancement. And there isn't just a sort of an on-off switch of like relativity or no relativity. Rather, there's many degrees of relativistic thinking. And usually people are capable of some degree of relativistic thinking, but it's very minor. And so as you move through the post-conventional stages, it really ramps up. You become much more relativistic in your worldview, and then it gets really radical at the later stages, the very last few stages that we'll be talking about next time in part 3. So there's a realization at the post-conventional level that the meaning of things depends on one's relative position in regards to them, on one's personal perspective and interpretation of them. There is deep self-reflection that is beginning to happen. Awareness of one's own unexamined beliefs becomes almost painfully brought into one's consciousness. You have to wrestle basically with old beliefs that you've been programmed with in childhood and by your religion, by your culture, by science and all this in school, in university. Now you start to examine these beliefs more critically rather than just accepting them as a given or taking them for granted. The mind also opens up at this level to something beyond rationality. New epistemic modes, new ways of knowing the world than just logic, which was very popular in the expert and achiever stages, which were the conventional stages. Conventional is very logical, and then post-conventional is sort of post-rational, which often gets confused with pre-rational, sort of the Pre-rational, post-rational fallacy, conflating that distinction. Noticing of illusion and self-deception begins at this stage. All problems become a matter of perspective and the mind. So the problems aren't necessarily out there in the world. Maybe it's more about how I think and relate to the world. There's an ever-decreasing defensiveness and less blaming of others as we move up these stages, and a lot of this defensiveness falls away in the post-conventional stages. Language starts to be questioned, and it becomes complex. So the previous stages basically took language for granted, whereas now language, because it's sort of the medium through which the mind thinks and understands things, that medium itself becomes transparent to it's starting to become transparent to itself, and it's starting to observe itself, and language is kind of doing the sort of self-reflective looking in on itself and questioning itself and languaging about languaging. So it kind of becomes meta. And the language becomes meta. Materialist assumptions are starting to be questioned, although not completely, but they're starting to be. The full illusion of materialism is not broken until even beyond the post-conventional. For that, you really need to get to the transcendent and to the unitive, which we'll be talking about in part 3. Although objects are seen as permanent, their meaning is seen as context dependent. So remember, we said that the ego is a meaning-creating machine, and so in the past, the ego was creating meaning. That's what we mean sort of by that first half of the arc, the construction of the mind. It's constructing the world and its meaning of the world, and while denying that it's doing so. And then when the deconstruction process starts, that meaning, you start to think about, wait a minute, was that meaning baked into the objects and the situations, or am I projecting that meaning out into the world because I have this ego that has certain needs and has certain biases, and therefore it's projecting those biases on the world, and that's skewing what it's seeing out there. And sure enough, that's exactly the case, of course. And you discover ever deeper layers of that. The boundaries of concepts are seen to be much more flexible in the post-conventional stage.